Here are 55 pros and cons of living in Atlanta, Georgia. The first pro is the amount of economy growth that we're having here in Atlanta. Many major companies from all over the US are moving from the East Coast to the West Coast and specifically here to Atlanta. And this is certainly one of the biggest draws for why so many people are moving here. Another pro is the movie industry that's growing here in Atlanta. Did you know that many of the Avengers movies that have recently come out were filmed here in Metro Atlanta? On the downside, though, one of the cons of living here is the amount of construction that we're having all the time. No matter what time of day it is or what part of the city you're driving through, there always seems to be some kind of construction going on, which can be kind of a pain in the butt. And then on top of that, another con of living in Atlanta is that the infrastructure here is terrible, with the potholes in the roads and the power lines that we have that are above ground. I know in many parts of the US, the power lines are buried underground. Not here in Atlanta. Even in some neighborhoods, the power lines are still on power line poles, which makes for like jungles of these power lines filling the skyline, which is really a big turnoff for many people who live here. Also, you would think that today most of the homes would have high-speed internet, but not necessarily the case in Atlanta. Because of our poor infrastructure, not every home has high-speed internet, so you certainly have to think about that when you're finding your new home here in Atlanta. And then another con is that the building codes here in the city tend to be kind of antiquated. It's like many people who come here from other parts of the country are surprised to see some of the old building codes that we have here. For example, in homes that have basements, it's not required for the basement to be waterproofed, even though those spaces are below ground. So that's certainly a big problem with many of the homes here in Metro Atlanta. Another pro of living here, however, is the amount of job opportunities in the Metro Atlanta area, with the major companies that are moving here and the movie industry continuing to grow and the amount of construction that we're always having here. There's always plenty of job opportunities and plenty of work to be found here. And this is certainly a big draw for many people who are moving here. And then another pro is that we don't really have a lot of state regulation here in Georgia. I know in many other states in the country, the state is very involved in how you do businesses or business licenses or taxes and things like that. Here in Georgia, the state tends to take kind of a hands-off approach when it comes to these things. It's very easy to file for a business license. The state does not really interfere a whole lot with certain aspects of running a business, which is probably why we have antiquated building codes. But these pros and cons really are for the whole Metro Atlanta area in general. So let's talk specifically about the city of Atlanta. When it comes to living in the city, there are many things to do here, from the Georgia Aquarium to Zoo Atlanta. The Coke Museum is one of my favorites, the Georgia Football Hall of Fame. There are many things to do within the city of Atlanta. And then another one is the amount of parks that we have in Atlanta. Piedmont Park, West Side Park, Chastain Park. This is not really something that you find very commonly in other major cities of the US. It's rare to find so many trees and green space, but here in Atlanta, it's very common to find trees all throughout the city and many parks all around the city. Another big benefit of living in Atlanta is the Beltline. The Beltline is like a walking, jogging trail that goes all around the city. You literally could get to any part of Atlanta using this walking, jogging trail. Now, the trail is very long, so it would take you a while to get from one end of the city to the other. But the point is that they have this trail that connects the entire city. And so it's very easy to find these kinds of walking and jogging trails to get from one point of the city to another. And then another pro of living in Atlanta is the music scene that we have here. There are always concerts going on regularly in Atlanta, from Mercedes-Benz Stadium to Music Midtown to Lakewood Amphitheater. There's always some kind of concert going on, and that's because of the heavy music influence that we have here in Atlanta. However, it's certainly not all good in the city of Atlanta. There certainly are some problems in Atlanta, and one of those problems is that it is kind of crowded in Atlanta. We have had a lot of growth here in the last few years, which has been great, but there are certain parts of the city of Atlanta that are overly populated. So if you're wanting to live in an area where your neighbors are spread out and you have lots of land, like the city of Atlanta is not good for that because of how crowded it is here. And then another con of living in Atlanta is the public schools. The city of Atlanta is not really well known for having the best public schools. So most of people who want to move here to the metro Atlanta area, who have a high priority for finding excellent schools, tend to move to the suburbs of Atlanta where the schools are much better. But when it comes to the city of Atlanta, the schools are kind of dicey. And another con of living in Atlanta is that many of the roads here in metro Atlanta, I believe it's something like over 70 roads, are named with the word Peachtree in them. And this is super confusing for people who are new to Atlanta or for people who have lived here for a long time. It's like so many roads here are named Peachtree. Like you can't really say, oh, that place is off of Peachtree. Like that is not nearly descriptive enough. And on top of that, one of the main roads that runs through Atlanta is Peachtree Road. And this is like a main road. This is very commonly, if you tell someone it's off of Peachtree, it doesn't matter which one of the 70 roads that are called Peachtree you're referring to, they're going to assume it's the Peachtree Road. So this is certainly something that has been very confusing for many people. And then some other pros of living in Atlanta is that it's very easy to walk through the city. This is not the kind of city where you would need a vehicle. Like you can get from your home to a grocery store all within walking distance in Atlanta. And then another thing is the amount of diversity that we have here in Atlanta. Many people think of Atlanta as being like the old school Atlanta that it was 20 or 30 years ago, but that's really not the case anymore. Atlanta has so many different cultural ethnicities represented here, and this is definitely a big benefit of living in Atlanta. And what comes with lots of different cultures and ethnicities here in Atlanta is the amount of food diversity that we have here. This is really a great city for finding excellent food options, so certainly something to think about if you plan on moving to Atlanta. However, when it comes to the Atlanta airport, one of the good sides is that we have a major airline that has its hub here in Atlanta, and that's Delta. So it's very easy to find direct flights to many of the other airports in the country here from Atlanta. Like you often don't have to get a connecting flight to other airports in the US because of Delta Airlines and because of how busy the Atlanta airport is. And then while we're talking about the downsides of living in Atlanta, another one that you should know about is that the airport in Atlanta is terribly crowded and busy. Like, you know how in many states where there is a major airport and it has multiple terminals, like you drive to that specific portion of the airport and you use that security gate to get to that specific terminal. So there are multiple security gates for all of the airport. Not so in Atlanta. Every single one of the terminals in the Atlanta airport uses the same security gate. So this part of the airport is like a madhouse. When I go to the airport, I assume 30 minutes to an hour just to get through security. And this is certainly one of the worst parts about traveling out of Atlanta. Okay, we've talked about the city of Atlanta proper, but let's talk about the suburbs of Atlanta, because these are very different from the city. One benefit of living in the suburbs is that you're going to very often find much larger land lots than the city. It's very common to find lots of green space even within the neighborhoods in the suburbs of Atlanta. And we do have quite a bit of wildlife here, not like bears necessarily or mountain lions, nothing like that in the suburbs, but we do have lots of deer and we have squirrels and the occasional coyote. Maybe that's a downside. And then another benefit of living in the suburbs is the school ratings. They are much better than the city of Atlanta. And the suburbs like Marietta or Alpharetta or Swanee and many others, you can often find schools that are rated an 8 or a 9 or a 10 out of 10, which is really what many people are looking for in their new home. However, when it comes to the cons of living in the suburbs, one of those cons is just how far everything is. Nothing is really walkable in the suburbs. You absolutely need a vehicle, and you should expect often a 10 to 15 minute drive to get to the nearest grocery store, let alone any other important thing that you're trying to drive to. So you're certainly going to be very car dependent in the suburbs. On the pro side though, one thing that you should know about living in the suburbs of Atlanta is that there are arguably 50 to 75 cities surrounding Atlanta, which means there are lots of different options for which suburbs to live in when you're moving to the metro Atlanta area. There are options for home values and school ratings and the amount of outdoor activity that you're looking for. You can find different variety and different options in each one of these suburbs around Atlanta, which is another one of the cons of living in the suburbs. That car payment, the car insurance, paying for gas, unless of course you drive an electric vehicle. So that's certainly another one of the downsides of living in the suburbs of Atlanta. And then another pro about living in the suburbs is the amount of outdoor activities that we have here, from the Chattahoochee River to Lake Allatoona, Lake Lanier. There really are so many activities to be doing outside in Georgia. And this is really one of the highlights of living in Georgia. So if you're wanting to live in a city that has plenty of nature associated with it, then Metro Atlanta is certainly a great option. Okay, pretty sure this video is running extra long, so let's go through a speed run of pros and cons. On the pro side, Georgia has state income tax, which is a really big bummer, especially if you're coming from a state like Florida, which does not have state income tax. Also on the con side, the amount of traffic that we have here in Atlanta. Everybody loves to talk about that. And the crime here in Atlanta is certainly something that is kind of increasing little by little as more and more people are moving here. On the pro side, we have lots of sports here. If you're someone who's into sports, then Atlanta is a great place for that. But the Atlanta Braves, the Atlanta Hawks, so really we have some great options for sports. Also, Metro Atlanta is only about 1 to 2 hours from the North Georgia mountains, which is a really common place for people to vacation. And then also we're only about 4 to 6 hours away from the coast. The Gulf Coast is much better than the coast in Savannah though. And then also on the pro side of living in Atlanta, we have lots of young families who live here in Metro Atlanta, looking for those lower cost of living and the excellent school ratings. On the downside, however, we do get a lot of rain here in Atlanta, which is surprising. Seattle, which is often thought of as one of the rainier cities in the country, gets an average of 38 inches of rainfall per year. Metro Atlanta gets an average of 50 inches per year of rainfall. Also on the downside, the public transportation here in Metro Atlanta is terrible. I certainly do not recommend it. And then the amount of investment companies that we have here, they are buying lots of real estate, which is kind of good in the short term, but in the long term could be bad for real estate. Also, the people in Metro Atlanta are very friendly, which is not something we can say about some of the states in the US. And then one of the best pros about living in Metro Atlanta is that Metro Atlanta is the home of Chick-fil-A. So every street corner of Atlanta has a Chick-fil-A. On the pro side, we have lots of farmers markets in the suburbs, which are a great place to find produce in your local city. Okay, let's talk about the housing market in Metro Atlanta and the pros and cons associated with that. Right now, the cost of homes are 9.5% less in Metro Atlanta than they are in the other major cities of the US. Also, property taxes tend to be lower in Metro Atlanta than other states, about 1% of the value of the home for property taxes in Atlanta. And then another benefit is that the home values continue to appreciate regularly year after year, even though many people are talking about recession, which means you could buy a home today and it's very likely that you would have equity built up in that home within a year or two. The downside, however, is that home prices continue to increase here in Metro Atlanta every year, which makes it very difficult for people to buy a home here every year. Also, on the downside for the housing market in Metro Atlanta is that there is lots of demand for homes here, which I guess is good if you're selling a home, but if you're wanting to buy a home in Metro Atlanta, you are very often competing with lots of people. On the pro side of the housing market is that many of the homes here in Metro Atlanta are part of a community with tennis courts and pools and a clubhouse, and this is a great way to meet lots of your neighbors. On the downside, though, is that most of the homes are associated with one of these HOAs, which have these rules, and it's something that a lot of people try to stay away from with these HOAs and their amount of rules and regulations that they have. Another con that you should know about when it comes to buying a home here is that many of the homes here are outdated and they kind of have these styles from like the 90s and early 2000s. I don't know what it is about the Georgia style, but very often people from other states like California or Florida come here to Georgia and are very surprised by how outdated many of the homes here are. In addition to that, it's not just the homes, it's even the commercial areas. In general, when I go from Georgia to California, it's like I feel like I'm traveling to the future. Everything there on the West Coast feels just a lot more progressed, a lot more like ahead of schedule, ahead of the times. Here in Metro Atlanta, it's like things are behind the times by a couple years or maybe 5 to 10 years. So it's certainly something to think about because it's not just the homes and the commercial areas. It's like all of the areas, even the public spaces, everything in general about the appearance of Metro Atlanta just seems to be a bit more outdated than other parts of the US. Oh, real quick, nature. We have all 4 seasons here in Metro Atlanta: spring, summer, fall, winter, which is something that a lot of people want to experience. However, on the downside, the summers are terrible here. It is super humid and it is the worst time of the year. Also on the downside, when the weatherman says anything about snow here in Georgia, people here are just not used to it. So like the whole state shuts down, the grocery stores, the roads, the schools, everything. They just freak out over even like an inch of snow, which is really weird. And then because there's so much humidity here in Georgia, that also means that there are a lot of bugs here in Georgia. Like if you own a home here in Metro Atlanta, you certainly need to have pest control quarterly for your home because of how many bugs we have here. Another part of the amount of trees that we have is the allergies. Allergies tend to be a problem for certain people during certain seasons, and it's kind of a problem here in Metro Atlanta. On the pro side, though, we rarely get natural disasters. We don't get earthquakes, hurricanes. Like they usually die down to tropical storms by the time they get here to Atlanta. And then tornadoes are very seldom. It's not something that happens very often here. Like we do get an occasional tornado, but it's not like the Midwest. It's not like Kansas. You know, it's very rare to see a tornado here in Metro Atlanta. And then the last one is that the cost of living for some people, it's higher here in Metro Atlanta than where they're from. And for some people, it's much lower. If you want a full breakdown of the cost of living in Atlanta, Georgia, check out this video. I'll see you there.